This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern. Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we simply cannot thank you enough. This episode is part of a series in partnership with the Israel office of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, taking a deep dive into issues that shape our lives here in Israel. My guest today is a research fellow at Tel Aviv University's Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern and African Studies. He specializes in regional geopolitics in the Middle East with a focus on Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries. Dr. Brandon Friedman, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Gilad, good morning. Thanks for having me.
So the normalization of ties between Israel and four Arab countries, known collectively as the Abraham Accords, was seen by many, even detractors of Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu, as heralding a new chapter in the Middle East. Then came the October 7th attacks, the deadliest and most devastating episode in the history of Israel and Palestine, virtually. Were the earlier celebrations premature?
So let's take a step back. At the risk of sounding pedantic, it's important to emphasize that the Abraham Accords, properly conceived of, are really Israel's peace and normalization agreements with the Emirates and Bahrain. Morocco and Sudan, who signed peace and normalization agreements with Israel afterwards, really probably wouldn't embrace this notion of being part of the Abraham Accords. Morocco sort of sees their agreement with Israel as almost a renormalization. There existed ties, and therefore they don't necessarily see themselves as part of the Gulf agreements. And Sudan today is in the midst of a brutal civil war that's ongoing. And I would say at the time that they signed their agreement, it was really a deal with the Americans to get themselves off the state-sponsored list of terror states. And I'm not sure necessarily they fit this neat category of Abraham Accords. But the question you ask is a good one, which is the spirit of the agreements. Are they still relevant in a post-October 7th world? And I think the answer is absolutely. Obviously with some, I suppose, caveats. And I would think about these accords as a range of relationships. They're political, security, economic. And in terms of the government-to-government ties, I think they're quite strong. The Gulf countries made a commitment, and I think that they're not interested in abandoning or breaking that commitment. It's at the levels beyond the G to G, the government-government ties. I think that things have changed a little bit. You're looking at a first generation of young Gulf people who've never seen the Israeli-Palestinian conflict unfold in front of their eyes with the kind of death and destruction that we're seeing in the current war. And so it was always a conflict in living memory of their parents and grandparents. And I think that now what they're seeing every night and hearing about every day is the conflict in real time. And for many in the Gulf, which has a very young population, this is new.
There was this feeling when the agreements were signed in 2020 that they might send positive repercussions across the region. As you said, indeed they did to Morocco and to a certain extent to Sudan. But there was a feeling that it was like the beginning of a new era in the Middle East. Has any of that materialized, even to a tiny extent?
First of all, there was an interesting article written in Foreign Affairs by a crisis group analyst called Joost Hilterman, in which he said, he sort of described it as a mirage, this period of de-escalation and normalization. And I think that, frankly, is an exaggeration. I think there was a period of 2.5 to 3 years in which there was a broad sense of de-escalation and normalization throughout the region, above and beyond the Abraham Accords in Israel. We saw Turkey made a number of normalization agreements and repair its ties across the region. We saw Qatar and the Saudis bury their hatchet after a 3.5-year blockade. We saw Iran make steps at repairing its relationships with the the Arab Gulf states. So this thing was real. It wasn't a mirage.
And do you think that the Abraham Accords were part of that broader regional?
I think it was.
trend?
I think the Abraham Accords were a catalyst for it. Absolutely, for two reasons. The first reason being, obviously, once you begin moving in the direction of de-escalation, normalization, and ties in the region are changing, no one wants to feel isolated. No one wants to be left out. And I think a lot of Turkey's actions, in particular, and Iran's, were driven by the notion, well, if there are regional relationships that are being reshuffled, we don't want to be left on the outside, okay? That's the first reason. The second major thing that happened, and I would argue probably the most important in driving these new economic and security relationships, were the new ties between China and the U.S., which had grown sharper and more intense. And there was a fear, I think, that the global economy might fracture into two camps, similar to what we saw during the Cold War in the 20th century between the Soviets and the Americans. And I think that created a great deal of fear. How are we going to maintain our economies in a world where globalization might be fragmenting? And so I think if I understood it correctly, that a lot of what was happening was driven by the sense of we're now in a world where there's a much sharper global competition between China and the United States, and that forces us to take stock of the regional situation and perhaps adjust.
Where does Saudi Arabia come into all this? I mean, as really a major player in the region, there were talks throughout that golden era that you talked about that Saudi Arabia might join in, even before and after the 7th of October.
Sure, I think it's really important to understand that, and we can talk a little bit more about the details of this prospective Saudi-Israeli normalization deal as it's been discussed since early spring of 2023. I think it's wrong to frame the Saudis as joining the Abraham Accords. The Saudis certainly would not want to be perceived as joining the Abraham Accords. I think the Saudis want to be seen as initiating and leading their own thing. This is part of their competitive dynamics with the Emirates. I think the Emirates and the Saudis, while they had a period of very good relationship, and certainly there was a strong relationship for a time between the two leaders, MBZ and MBS, Mohammed bin Zayed and Mohammed bin Salman, who is the crown prince in Saudi Arabia. But I think that Saudi Arabia wants to be seen as delivering something that the Abraham Accords did not, which was something for the Palestinians. One of the perceptions was that the Abraham Accords did not deliver for the Palestinians, and that was its fatal flaw in the eyes of many of the critics. Now, certainly,
do you agree with that?
No, I don't. I think the Emiratis saw it as making themselves the dam between Israel and annexation of the Jordan Valley. At the time, for those who don't remember, the Trump administration was rolling out its vision for peace for prosperity. And there was talk in the immediate aftermath of the announcement early in 2020 that perhaps Israel would annex the Jordan Valley as part of this Trump peace plan. And I don't think the Trump administration was terribly happy with the Netanyahu administration's announcement. There was a bit of divide within the Trump administration on this issue between the camp led by the ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, and Jared Kushner, who was leading a lot of these contacts. But I think what the Emiratis saw themselves as doing is saying, look, if Netanyahu is willing to put annexation in the freezer, then we're willing to normalize. And so the Emirati narrative of what happened with the Abraham Accords is they stepped up and offered normalization in exchange for Israel stepping away and stepping back from any further annexation in the West Bank.
And what will the Saudis do that is different?
So the Saudis' perception is that they were going to deliver in two respects in ways that the Abraham Accords didn't. First of all, they were going to get the Palestinians on board. For those of you who don't remember, Mahmoud Abbas completely rejected the Trump administration's effort during his first term. This vision, peace for prosperity, was basically dead on arrival because there was no Palestinian buy-in. So the Saudis said, we're going to bring the Palestinians, and we're going to do that because we're going to offer them huge amounts of money during a time in which the Palestinian Authority is basically collapsing. And we're also going to try to get them some more territory in the West Bank. Specifically, there were talks of perhaps expanding their control in areas A, expanding security control in areas B, and perhaps even getting them the ability to develop economically more areas in Area C of the West Bank. Now, of course, the big oversight in all of these discussions in 2023 is where was Gaza in the whole situation? And that proved to be a very fateful oversight.
Yeah, Hamas even said themselves that what seemed to be like this rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Israel was one of the instigators of the 7th of October attacks.
I think, to me, the big story here with October 7th. Now, there are a lot of local drivers and catalysts for what Hamas did on October 7th. First and foremost, the decision-making and ideology of Hamas. So I don't want to marginalize it. I think that's probably the most important factor in understanding what happened on October 7th, particularly the ideology, which many in Israel overlooked for years and years. But I think there were two things happening over a much longer span of time in the region that most people ignored. First is, since the 2010-2011 Arab uprisings and the American withdrawal from Iraq in 2010-2011, we basically saw a decade, or a little bit more than a decade, of basically civil war, chaos, and destruction throughout the region. The Islamic State, civil wars in Yemen, Syria, brutal and catastrophic civil wars in Yemen and Syria and also Libya, which basically sucked the bandwidth out of the Israeli-Palestinian issue. For years and years, what defined Middle Eastern politics was the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Arab-Israeli conflict on top of that. Throughout the 20th century, that's what animated Middle Eastern politics. What we saw over the last decade to 12 years was basically the Israeli-Palestinian issue was completely marginalized. And I think what Hamas saw was after the Abraham Accords and after the Biden administration rolled out this potential normalization agreement that involved a defense pact for the Saudis, Hamas said, well, the Palestinian issue is being completely buried here. That obviously, that's my perception of what Hamas was thinking. And I think for Iran...
And that was also what Netanyahu was thinking for his own reasons.
Right. Obviously, the Netanyahu policy towards Hamas, in my opinion, really, you have to look at 2018 as a turning point. When Lieberman says we need to do something meaningful in Gaza, there was Israel carried out a raid in Gaza that resulted in a clash that looked like it might have potentially turned into a war in November 2018. It didn't. And the reason it didn't was that this was the period in which Netanyahu initiated the cash flowing in through Qatar into Gaza. And many people felt that that was the solution to managing the conflict in Gaza. And what we've learned is that the conflict can't be managed. That this notion that maintaining a illusory status quo is sustainable. And I think that that's also one of the lessons of October 7th. But I just want to get back to this issue of Iran, because I think it's really important. Iran is one of Hamas's most important partners. They've provided Hamas with immense resources, both strategically and in terms of financially. And I don't think that Hamas would have been able to carry out this kind of attack without the full support of Iran. And it's clear that Iran also saw this potential Saudi-Israeli-American grand bargain as a return to an American security architecture in the region, something that threatened the gains that they had fought for in Syria and elsewhere in the region over the last 10 years. They have spent the last few years trying to lock in and consolidate their victories in Syria and Iraq. And here the Americans come along and say, well, we're potentially going to give the Saudis nuclear assistance. We're going to normalize between Israel and the Saudis. And where is Iran in this whole story? So I think the notion that Iran was going to be somehow marginalized in regional politics after a decade in which Iran clawed its way back to the center of regional politics is a real storyline here that has been overlooked.
How close do you think the Saudis and the Americans were to clinching a deal on the eve of the 7th of October?
Well, look, these are complex deals, and there are always a lot of diplomatic lifting that goes on after, in spirit, or in principle, the 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 parties in this case are on board. But I think, and this is really important to understand, the Saudis seem to feel confident they could bring Abbas and the Palestinian Authority on board. And I think that Biden felt that they had the kind of feedback from the Netanyahu administration that this was doable prior to October 7th. I'm not sure Netanyahu, in his heart of hearts, was going to go along with how the Biden administration envisioned the solution for the Palestinians. But I thought that I genuinely thought that there was a diplomatic deal to be done here. And I think that in principle, they were on board to seriously trying to move it forward.
Were the Palestinians on board as well?
It looked like it. At least, let's say the Abbas West Bank Palestinian leadership.
Clearly. Yeah.
When we talk about whether the Palestinians are on board. And again, that's a significant oversight. Everyone thought that Hamas could sort of be dragged along with this. And Hamas has proven historically to be a spoiler in any major effort to make peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Hamas historically has done everything it can to subvert that, to sabotage it, to undermine it. And perhaps that was a blind spot in the deal makers. But I want to emphasize this point. And for an Israeli audience, it's really important because I felt that many of the Israeli analysts on when this deal was moving forward beginning in the spring up until October 7th, were talking about Biden seeking a historical deal that he felt would give him a boost going into the election. And that this somehow the prestige of doing this deal would deliver for him. And that to me was a misreading of American politics. There are very few American voters, and I said this prior to October 7th, so I'm not saying this post facto, who vote on Middle East peacemaking. It just is so far away for them. You know, apart from the Jewish, perhaps a portion of the Jewish community in the United States, American voters tend to vote on things like the price of gasoline. And I think that the Biden administration understood, and they understood in an election year it would be important to have Saudi support for global energy markets in the year of an election, because the price of oil, the price of gasoline at the pump is something that American voters tend to vote on. And so I think that the Biden administration very much wanted to have a Saudi commitment to helping the Biden administration during an election year. And that was animating a lot of their interest in this deal. Because why else would a first-term president commit enormous political capital to trying to make this deal during a time in which you have a war in Ukraine, you have China and the U.S. Navigating a very rocky relationship, and an American economy that's dealing with a lot of pressures. And so I think that, to me, the idea here was this was a U.S.-Saudi deal that needed to run through Jerusalem and Ramallah to a certain extent in order for the Saudis and the Americans to get what they wanted.
So it's basically a bilateral agreement more than anything else. Israel and the Palestinians were just, I don't know if props, but...
Pre-October 7th, that's how I saw it. Post-October 7th, I think there's something very different going on. Now you have American prestige, American global leadership at stake, the wars, both with respect to Gaza and Lebanon, and you could argue more broadly with Iran, and America's ability to manage those wars is a statement about America's position in the world. And so, whereas prior to October 7th, I sort of felt that this deal was being driven by a Biden election calculus. Post-October 7th, I think it's turned into something very different.
So, at the risk of sounding simplifying ad absurdum, what you said about the price of gasoline, is it what really has defined U.S.-Saudi relations throughout the years?
You know, I gave a lecture a few days before October 7th in 2023, and I joked, and I've made this joke several times since, that one of the ways you can characterize the Saudi-American relationship is oil for security. The Saudis provide global oil markets with stability, and the Americans provide the Saudis with some sense of security. That relationship has deteriorated and fractured over the last 15 years, in part because of the U.S. Unconventional oil revolution. The U.S. is now a major energy producer, both in terms of oil and natural gas. And so the feeling is that the U.S. needs the Saudis less. I think that's a misperception. But I think...
Misperception by whom?
But both in terms of certain American political elites, but I also think more globally, there's a perception that since America is now this global energy giant, it doesn't need Middle Eastern oil anymore. And that historically is incorrect. And if you want, I can expand, but I first want to finish this thought. My sense of the relationship, right, is that the Saudis are now animated by MBS's vision of a new Saudi Arabia, which is a nationalist vision, okay? A vision of Saudi nationalism, which didn't really exist in the history of the modern kingdom up until MBS. And I think that ultimately what he would like to see is Saudi Arabia that is independently strong, not just in global oil markets, but independently strong regionally and as a global player. And that means having the ability to project its own independent power capability. It doesn't have that. It learned it didn't have that during the war in Yemen between 2015 and today, which was, for the Saudis, a colossal failure. And so I think in the Saudi mindset, or at least the mindset of MBS and those who support him, the notion is, we'd like to have a strong, independent Saudi Arabia. We're not yet there. And so until we're there, we continue to need American security, protection, and support. And so one might say, and here's the joke, oil for security as the formula for U.S.-Saudi relationships is dead, but long live oil for security. Because the Saudis are not yet there. I don't think that the Americans are quite as oil independent as many American political elites believed over the last decade or since the fracking revolution. And so they continue to need each other, the Americans and the Saudis.
I would like you to expand a bit on MBS's nationalist vision for Saudi Arabia. What does it really mean in practice?
Sure. In my opinion, there are three major transformations happening in the modern Saudi kingdom today, okay? And each of them you could describe as a mini revolution. And I know it's a bit of an exaggeration or hyperbole to speak in those terms, but I really think in Saudi terms, when you look at Saudi history, those three major transformations are revolutionary. And what are they? The first is they're trying to move away from a oil-dependent economy where the state treasury is completely dependent on oil revenues to a market-driven economy. And in order to have a market-driven economy, you have to incentivize people to work, because the Saudi social pact or social contract that existed for most of its history up until now was, we'll give you a fat social economic set of benefits, including a cushy government job. And in exchange, you won't comment on political issues. The political issues will remain in the hands of the political and religious leadership of the country. That was what was called the rentier model in Saudi Arabia. But the Saudi ability to sustain that, as the elites currently recognize, is limited. Why? Because the demand for oil is reaching its peak. With the global movement to shift from fossil fuel driven economies to green and renewable energies, the Saudis recognize that time is limited in terms of the ability to sustain their country based solely on oil revenues. So what they're trying to do is switch to a market-driven economy. If you want a market-driven economy, people need to work. So you're asking people who for 2 or 3 generations were asked not to work, all of a sudden to work. And that includes half the population that are women, okay? Women in Saudi Arabia were always marginalized in the social economic sphere in Saudi Arabia. They were told to stay at home. And so I think what we're seeing now is the Crown Prince wants to mobilize half the population that's never been used before. 2/3 of the Saudi population is also under 30 years old. And so he wants to give young people a new way of life. A life that includes work, a life that includes leisure activities that haven't existed in Saudi Arabia until the Crown Prince came along, and that's why we're seeing all kinds of new entertainment options. And part of the reason he's doing that is he realizes if you want people to contribute to society and the economy, you also have to provide a social atmosphere in which they can enjoy themselves, right, to a certain degree, within a proper in a proper Saudi social context. So the two revolutions I've described, one is the economic revolution from a rentier model to a market economy. And the second is almost a social revolution in which it's a revolution of lifestyle, in which all the kinds of strict religious and tribal norms that dominated Saudi lifestyle up until now are slowly being relaxed. And not so slowly even. Over the last 4 or 5 years, they've been dramatically relaxed. I'll give you one example. Ikhtilat, which is the practice of gender segregation in Saudi Arabia. Women and men can't socialize in public together. That's been lifted in the last 6 years under Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. So you can see men and women going to a concert of a Western performer together and standing side by side in the audience Whereas 10 years ago, you couldn't have men and women in the same restaurant who weren't part of the same family being seen together. So I think that the changes in the kingdom are quite substantial socially. And the third, I would argue, is the question of Saudi defense. And this I already mentioned, which is the notion that the Saudis, since World War II, have been dependent on America for ultimately guaranteeing their security. And what we're seeing now is a movement away from that, an attempt to diversify their defense relationships. And I think their desire for nuclear capabilities is part of that, because, frankly, nuclear weapons are seen as the ultimate form of an independent security guarantee.
And is this why the Biden administration has really flip-flopped on its relationship with MBS, because they felt like Saudi Arabia was slipping through the fingers?
Absolutely. I think that there was this famous Jeddah summit in 2022, and where Biden went to Saudi Arabia, and MBS and Biden did a fist bump after Biden had promised during his campaign to be elected that he would turn Saudi Arabia into a pariah state as a result of MBS's execution of Jamal Khashoggi, who was a dissident Saudi journalist who was killed in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul in October 2018. And what Biden found was he needed Saudi help in order to stabilize global markets as the world came out of the pandemic. All of a sudden, the global economy had shut down. The American economy was coming back to life. People were starting to go out and work again and travel again, and there wasn't enough oil available. And so Americans were feeling this huge spike in the price of gasoline, and there was a lot of political pressure. This was right around midterm elections for Biden, and there was a lot of political pressure to do something about it. And he thought he had a deal with the Saudis, and the Saudis reneged on that deal in October 2022. And I think the sense was that Biden hadn't gone far enough in sort of trying to repair and improve the relationship with the Saudis. And that's where I see this sort of Saudi-Israeli normalization deal coming from.
Mm-hmm. Let's take a longer view of Saudi involvement in the Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking and conflict management. There's a lot to be said about other turning points and perhaps bookends in that history. But if we go back to 2002, to the Arab Peace Initiative, also known as the Saudi Peace Initiative, because it came from King Abdullah and later ratified several times by the entire Arab League. How do you see the evolution of the Saudi take on Israel and Palestine from 2002 to 2023?
Sure. It's a great question. So, first of all, I would argue that it is an evolution in the sense that up until MBS, Saudi Arabia always approaches almost historically almost every major issue that's important to Saudi Arabia very cautiously and incrementally. And here you have MBS come along, and he's been a major disruptor, to use high-tech language, right? He doesn't do things incrementally and in evolutionary terms. He does things in a very sudden way. He wants to get things done as he sees it. This leads to a lot of, in the minds of many, reckless mistakes. But in many senses, it also leads to change that outsiders often feel is long overdue in the kingdom. So I would argue that the Arab Peace Initiative is extremely important to the older generations of Saudis. Mohammed bin Salman's father, who is still king, who looks and has always embraced the Palestinian issue as being an important one, not just to him personally, but to his entire generation. And I think that MBS is very respectful of the position of his elders and his father as king, and has tried very much to couch what he wants to do with Israel and potentially with the Israeli-Palestinian issue in the framework of the Arab Peace Initiative, because he wants to be respectful of the older generation of Saudis who see the Palestinian issue in a much more personal way than perhaps MBS does. And so my sense of it is that what October 7th has done, if MBS had wiggle room in terms of what he could prospectively deliver for the Palestinians and still get normalization done, October 7th has sort of taken that wiggle room away. What you hear the Saudis and other people in the Gulf say is the price has gone up for Saudi-Israeli normalization, which means in Saudi terms that Israel will have to deliver much more for the Palestinians than perhaps they might have pre-October 7th. And I think that's why you'll see post-October 7th a lot more talk about the Arab Peace Initiative formula. Because there's already an outline, it's much more respectful of what the older generation wants. And in the wake of October 7th, I would argue the vast majority of Saudis are much more sympathetic to the Palestinians perhaps than they were prior to October 7th.
So that actually poses a conundrum for the incoming Trump administration, because on the one hand, they're really keen on getting things done, just like MBS himself, with respect to the spirit of the Abraham Accords and its expansion to Saudi Arabia. And I know you have reservations on it, as you said before, but you get what I mean.
I do.
And on the other hand, many in his administration, even the first administration and the incoming administration, are very negative on, their maximum for what it takes for Palestinians is well below the minimum for the Saudis and probably every other international player. How do you think that is going to be resolved, if at all?
My reading of the Trump administration's approach to peacemaking was always, the Gulfies are going to bring along the Palestinians, and I'll bring along the Israelis. And if you read someone like Barak Ravid's book about the years in which the Abraham Accords were agreed to, there was a lot of tension between Trump and Netanyahu. I would argue that Trump, to a certain degree, felt that Netanyahu wasn't as interested in him as getting a deal done. And I think that he felt, for example, that moving the embassy to Jerusalem, recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital, recognizing Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, opining that that America didn't have the right to tell Israel what it could or couldn't do with respect to the settlements. Those were sort of American down payments on goodwill for what the Trump administration wanted to do in terms of Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking, meaning leverage, as Trump saw it, over the Netanyahu administration for if and when a deal became available. And I think that if Trump feels that he has a good deal in the offing available, I think he's going to try to put pressure on the Netanyahu administration to come around. But there's going to be some tension even within the Trump administration, because I think you're going to see people like the newly named ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, and others who are very sympathetic to the annexation narrative, run into resistance from people like Kushner, who may be seeing a deal as being more in the Trump administration's interest. So it will be interesting to see how these things play out, because they were important components of the Abraham Accords process. There was this tension between right-wing elements in Israel and their sympathizers in the Trump administration, and those who were close to Trump, who were more interested in seeing Trump be able to get his deal of the century done. Yeah. And so we'll have to see that play out.
Trump is famously unpredictable, but do you think that there's a chance that he might invest the political capital and perhaps take risks and pull his weight behind an Israeli-Palestinian deal, whatever it is, given, past experience that it's not going to be an easy ride?
So the answer is I don't think Trump personally is going to put a lot of investment in it. That's not the way he has demonstrated he governs. He sort of appoints a point person, lets that person invest a lot of time and effort, and if they've got a victory they can bring to him, then perhaps he'll sign on and support it, and he'll expect others to. So I don't think we should expect Trump to be Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was personally invested in the Camp David Accords in 1979. He spent so much of his presidential capital on that deal. I don't think we're going to see that kind of investment from Trump. That's not his style. It's not the way he's demonstrated he's going to govern. And I also think there are going to be other major issues pulling at him in terms of his attention. I would say that the biggest obstacle potentially, as I see it, for a Trump administration deal of this kind of the kind we've been discussing, is that if it involves giving a security guarantee to the Saudis, which is what the Biden deal involved, the Saudis were asking for a security guarantee, a kind of defense treaty similar to NATO or similar to what the U.S. has with Japan, which is a little bit more informal than NATO, or South Korea. The issue there is that the ideology of those surrounding Trump and Trump himself is they don't like treaty commitments for defense. Right? They don't think on an ideological level that it's the U.S.'s business to be protecting others. And so I think one of the major problems or challenges, maybe is the better word for it, in this deal that the Trump administration is inheriting from Biden is Biden saw U.S. partnerships, alliances, defense relationships as very much part of the structure of American global leadership. Trump doesn't buy into that at all. And so if this deal requires the U.S. to make a security commitment, people like Mike Waltz, who's been announced as Trump's national security advisor, and others don't look so favorably on tying the U.S. into long-term defense commitments, which is what the Saudis are really looking for. And so that raises a big question in my mind in terms of how this deal will be structured so that the Saudis get what they want. Because if the Saudis aren't getting what they want, then they're not going to deliver for the Palestinians, and then you don't have a deal. Because again, there are huge domestic issues in Israel already regarding anything that would be a commitment to Palestinian state.
Yeah, and then you don't know whether the Saudi, Palestinian, and Israeli stars are going to align, regardless of how America acts on it.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right, Dr. Brandon Friedman, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And many thanks to Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios, and to the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for the generous support. And now we've got a request, because many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. Good, bad, ugly, up to you. You can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has close to 1,000 interviews and probably more by now. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and most important, join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from us here in Tel Aviv, goodbye.